All right, everybody, this is Chapter 8 of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, edited by Sean Matt Gomna. This chapter is titled Petty-bourgeois Opposition, Proletarian Party, ? A charge against the minority in the dispute among the Trotskyists over Poland and Finland in 1934, one still accepted even by many who no longer think that the Stalinist USSR was a worker state, was that they were a, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote. Three chief bits of evidence for this charge have been repeated over the years. One, that Burnham and Shachtman led the minority, and that Burnham and Shachtman both ended up, quote, choosing the West, end quote, in the Cold War. But no political tendency can be judged by that political tendency's renegades or by that tendency's activist vagaries in demoralized old age. Least of all, when its texts give the most cogent refutations of those vagaries and renegacies. Moreover, the majority of 1939 to 40 slid into, quote, choosing the East, end quote, quicker. 2. That their arguments on Poland and Finland reflected the pressure of bourgeois democratic public opinion. But the Shachtmanite stance in World War II affronted bourgeois democratic public opinion more than the Cannonites', quote, proletarian military policy, end quote, and, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote. 3. That the minority's leaders had a long record of, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, slidings over the years before 1939. The third argument came with the authority of Leon Trotsky himself. I was actually just listening to, because I'm kind of like absorbed in the meat of all this, but it was a review by Ed Maltby of this book, and he was talking about how, I don't know if Shachtman says in his introduction or if this is an original idea by Ed Maltby. It's not that particularly original, but I think it does summarize the situation aptly, is that Shachtman tailed along the West in the same way that Cannon tailed along the East. Anyway, first piece in this chapter is titled A Record of Petty Bourgeois Slidings. It's by Leon Trotsky and from 1940. These are excerpts from Trotsky's, quote, From a Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene. It's from January 1940. It's interesting that this is the first piece because I'm actually listening to the audiobook I made of From a Scratch to Gangrene for my own purposes. So look at that. Really doubling down on this piece today. Comrade Shachtman invites me to present proof of the existence of a, quote, petty bourgeois tendency, end quote, in the party during the past year, or even 2-3 years. Shachtman is completely justified in not wishing to refer to the more distant past, but in accordance with Shachtman's invitation, I shall confine myself to the last 3 years. Please pay attention to the rhetorical questions of my unsparing critic. I shall reply with a few exact documents. 1. On the 25th of May, 1937, I wrote to New York concerning the policy of the Bolshevik-Leninist faction in the Socialist Party, i.e. the Trotskyist group, which became the Socialist Workers' Party, which was then active as a minority in the Socialist Party, end bracket. Quote, ... I must cite 2 recent documents, a private letter of, quote, Max about the convention, and B, Shachtman's article, Towards a Revolutionary Socialist Party. The title of this article alone characterizes a false perspective. It seems to me established by the developments, including the last convention, that the party is evolving not into a, quote, revolutionary, end quote, party, but into a kind of independent labor party, reference to the UK, that is, a miserable centrist political abortion without any perspective. The affirmation that the American Socialist Party is now, quote, closer to the position of revolutionary Marxism than any party of the second or third internationals, end quote, is an absolutely unmerited compliment. The American Socialist Party is only more backward than the analogous formations in Europe, such as the POUM, ILP, SAP, etc., ... Our duty is to unmask this negative advantage of Norman Thomas and co., and not to speak about the, quote, superiority, parenthesis, of the war resolution, end parenthesis, over any resolution ever adopted by the party, end quote. This is a purely literary appreciation because every resolution must be taken in connection with historical events, with the political situation, and its imperative needs, end quote. Trotsky. In both of the documents mentioned above, Shachtman revealed excessive adaptability toward the left wing of the petty-bourgeois Democrats, political mimicry, a very dangerous symptom in a revolutionary politician. It is extremely important to take note of Shachtman's high appraisal of the, quote, radical, end quote, position of Norman Thomas in relation to war, in Europe. Opportunists, as is well known, tend to all the greater radicalism the further removed they are from events. With this law in mind, it is not difficult to appraise at its true value the fact that Shachtman and Shachtman's allies accuse us of a tendency to, quote, capitulate to Stalinism, end quote. Alas, sitting in the Bronx, it is much easier to display irreconcilability toward the Kremlin than toward the American petty bourgeoisie. 2. To believe Comrade Shachtman, I dragged the question to the class composition of the factions into the dispute by the hair. Here, too, let us refer to the recent past. On the 3rd of October 1937, I wrote to New York, quote, I have remarked hundreds of times that the worker who remains unnoticed in the, quote, normal, end quote, conditions of party life reveals remarkable qualities in a change of the situation when general formulas and fluent pens are not sufficient, where acquaintance with the life of workers and practical capacities are necessary. Under such conditions, a gifted worker reveals a sureness of himself and reveals also his general political capabilities. Predominance in the organization of intellectuals is inevitable in the first period of the development of the organization. Predominance in the organization of intellectuals is at the same time a big handicap to the political education in the more gifted workers, It is absolutely necessary at the next convention to introduce in the local and central committees as many workers as possible. To a worker, activity in the leading party body is at the same time a high political school, The difficulty is that in every organization there are traditional committee members and that different secondary, factional, and personal considerations play too great role in the composition of the list of candidates, end quote. Get out of here, man. One second. I gotta take a picture of something real quick. One second. Sorry, there's this thing that's been happening. So I'm sitting on a wooden picnic table in the backyard of my parents' house, right? And there's a umbrella here that I sit under, and little frogs fall out of little baby frog, toad, something things fall out of the tree. And I was at first I thought it was some plastic toy that my father just stuck up there or something. But then one day I butted it with the point of the dull end of my pen to see if it was a toy, and it jumped. And now it's moving around now. God knows what it's gonna do. So hi, buddy. Which name should I give you? Peter. For some reason that name came to mind. Peter the Toad thing. Anyway, where the hell am I? Predominance in the this is still a quote. Predominance in the organization of intellectuals is inevitable in the first period of the development of the organization. Predominance in the organization of intellectuals is at the same time a big handicap to the political education of the more gifted workers. It is absolutely necessary at the next convention to introduce in the local and central committees as many workers as possible. To a worker, activity in the leading party body is at the same time a high political school, ... The difficulty is that in every organization there are traditional committee members and that different secondary, factional, and personal considerations play a too great role in the composition of all the list of candidates, end quote. I have never met either attention or interest from Comrade Shachtman in questions of this kind. Section 3. To believe Comrade Shachtman, I injected the question of Comrade Martin Aberrant's faction as a concentration of petty bourgeois individuals artificially and without any basis in fact. Yet on the 10th of October 1937, at a time when Shachtman marched shoulder to shoulder with Cannon and it was considered officially that Aberrant had no faction, I wrote to Cannon, quote, "The party has only a minority of genuine factory workers, ... The non-proletarian elements represent a very necessary yeast, and I believe that we can be proud of the good quality of these elements, ... But, ... Our party can be inundated by non-proletarian elements and can even lose our party's revolutionary character. The task is naturally not to prevent the influx of intellectuals by artificial methods, ... But to orient practically all the organization toward the factories, the strikes, the unions, ... A concrete example, we cannot devote enough or equal force to all the factories. Our local organization can choose for our local organization's activity in the next period one factory or two or three factories in its area and concentrate all its forces upon these factories. If we have in one of them 2 or 3 workers, we can create a special help commission of 5 non-workers with the purpose of enlarging our influence in these factories. The same can be done among the trade unions. We cannot introduce non-worker members in workers' unions, but we can with success build up commissions for oral and literary action in connection with our comrades in the union. The unbreakable conditions should be not to command the workers, but only to help the workers, to give the workers suggestions, to arm the workers with the facts, ideas, factory papers, special leaflets, and so on." Quote, "Such collaboration," oh no, this is still the same quote, "Such collaboration would have a tremendous educational importance from one side for the worker comrades, from the other side for the non-workers who need a solid re-education. You have, for example, an important number of Jewish non-worker elements in your ranks. These Jewish non-worker elements can be very valuable yeast if the party succeeds by and in extracting these Jewish non-worker elements from a closed milieu and ties the Jewish non-worker elements to the factory workers by daily activity. I believe such an orientation would also assure a more healthy atmosphere inside the party. One general rule we can establish immediately. A party member who doesn't win during 3 or 6 months a new worker for the party is not a good party member. If we established seriously such a general orientation, and if we verified every week the practical results, we will avoid a great danger, namely the intellectuals and white-collar workers might suppress the worker minority, condemn the worker minority to silence, transform the party into a very intelligent discussion club, but absolutely not habitable for workers. The same rules should be in a corresponding form elaborated for the working and the recruiting of the youth organizations. Otherwise, we run the danger of educating good young elements into revolutionary dilettantes and not revolutionary fighters," end quote. From this letter, it is obvious, I trust, that I did not mention the danger of a petty bourgeois deviation the day following the Stalin-Hitler Pact or the day following the dismemberment of Poland, but brought the danger of a petty bourgeois deviation forward persistently 2 years ago and more. Furthermore, I then pointed out, bearing in mind primarily the, quote, non-existent, end quote, Aberrant faction, it was absolutely requisite in order to cleanse the atmosphere of the party that the Jewish petty bourgeois elements of the New York local be shifted from the Jewish petty bourgeois elements of the New York locals' habitual conservative milieu and dissolved in the real labor movement. It is precisely because of this that the above letter, parenthesis, not the first of this letter's kind, end parenthesis, written more than 2 years before the present discussion began, if of far greater weight as evidence than all the writings of the opposition leaders on the motives which impelled me to come out in defense of the, quote, Cannon clique, end quote. Section 4. Shachtman's inclination to yield to petty bourgeois influence, especially the academic and literary, has never been a secret to me. During the time of the Dewey Commission, I wrote on the 14th of October 1937 to Cannon, Shachtman, and Ward, quote, ... I insisted upon the necessity to surround the committee by delegates of workers' groups in order to create channels from the committee in the masses, ... Comrades Ward, Shachtman, and others declared themselves in agreement with me on this point. Together we analyzed the practical possibilities to realize this plan, ... But later, in spite of repeated questions from me, I never could have information about the matter, and only accidentally I heard that Comrade Shachtman was opposed to it. Why, I don't know, end quote. Shachtman never did divulge Shachtman's reasons to me. In my letter, I expressed myself with the utmost diplomacy, but I did not have the slightest doubt that while agreeing with me in words, Shachtman in reality was afraid of wounding the excessive political sensibilities of our temporary liberal allies. In this direction, Shachtman demonstrates exceptional, quote, delicacy, end quote. Section 5. On the 15th of April 1938, I wrote to New York, quote, I am a bit astonished about the kind of publicity given to Eastman's letter in the New International. The publication of Eastman's letter is all right, but the prominence given to Eastman's letter on the cover, combined with the silence about Eastman's article in Harper's, seems to me a bit compromising for the New International, the magazine. Many people will interpret this fact of our willingness to close our eyes on principles when friendship is concerned, end quote. Section 6. On the 1st of June, 1938, I wrote Comrade Shachtman, quote, It is difficult to understand here why you, Shachtman, are so tolerant and even friendly towards Mr. Eugene Lyons. He speaks, it seems, at your banquets. At the same time, he speaks at the banquets of the White Guards. End quote. Wikipedia says Eugene Lyons lived from 1898 to 1985 and was a Russian-born American journalist and writer, a fellow traveler of communism in his younger years. Lyons became highly critical of the Soviet Union after several years there as a correspondent of United Press International. Lyons also wrote a biography of President Herbert Hoover. Back to the text. Quote, It is difficult to understand why you are so tolerant and even friendly towards Mr. Eugene Lyons. Eugene Lyons speaks, it seems, at your banquets. At the same time, Eugene Lyons speaks at the banquets of the White Guards, end quote. This letter continued the struggle for a more independent and resolute policy toward the so-called, quote, liberals who, while waging a struggle against the revolution, wished to maintain, quote, friendly relations, end quote, with the proletariat. For this doubles the liberals' market value in the eyes of bourgeois public opinion. Section 7. On the 6th of October 1938, almost a year before the discussion began, I wrote about the necessity of our party press turning its face decisively toward the workers. Quote, Very important in this respect is the attitude of the Socialist Appeal. It is undoubtedly a very good Marxist paper, but it is not a genuine instrument of political action, ... I tried to interest the editorial board of the Socialist Appeal in this question, but without success, end quote. A note of complaint is evident in these words, and it is not accidental. Comrade Shachtman, as has been mentioned already, displays far more interest in isolated literary episodes of long-ago concluded struggles than in the social composition of Shachtman's own party or the readers of Shachtman's own paper. Section 8. On January 20th, 1939, in a letter which I have already cited in connection with dialectical materialism, I once again touched on the question of Comrade Shachtman's gravitation toward the milieu of petty bourgeois literary fraternity. Quote, I cannot understand why the Socialist Appeal is almost neglecting the Stalinist Party. This party now represents a mass of contradictions. Splits are inevitable. The next important acquisitions will surely come from the Stalinist Party. Our political attention should be concentrated on it. We should follow the development of its contradictions. Sorry, I gotta restart this quote. Quote, I cannot understand why the Socialist Appeal is almost neglecting the Stalinist Party. The Stalinist Party now represents a mass of contradictions. Splits are inevitable. The next important acquisitions will surely come from the Stalinist Party. Our political attention should be concentrated on it. We should follow the development of its contradiction day by day and hour by hour. Someone on the staff ought to devote the bulk of his time to the Stalinist ideas and actions. We could provoke a discussion of, and if possible, publish the letters of hesitating Stalinists. It would be 1,000 times more important than inviting Max Eastman, Eugene Lyons, and the others to present their individual sweatings. I was wondering a bit at why you gave place to Eastman's last insignificant and arrogant article, ... but I am absolutely perplexed that you personally invite these people to besmirch the not-so-numerous pages of the New International. The perpetuation of this polemic can interest some petty bourgeois intellectuals, but not the revolutionary elements. It is my firm conviction that a certain reorganization of New International and socialist appeal is necessary, more distance from Eastman, Lyons, and so on, and nearer the workers, and in this sense to the Stalinist Party, end quote. Recent events have demonstrated, sad to say, that Shachtman did not turn away from Eastman and Co., but on the contrary drew closer to Eastman and Co. Section 9. On May 27, 1939, I again wrote concerning the character of the socialist appeal in connection with the social composition of the party. Quote, from the minutes I see that you are having difficulty with the socialist appeal. The paper is very well done from the journalistic point of view. It is a paper for the workers and not a workers' paper. As it is, the paper is divided among various writers, each of whom is very good, but collectively they do not permit the workers to penetrate to the pages of the appeal. Each of them speaks for the workers, parentheses, speaks very well, end parentheses, but nobody will hear the workers. In spite of its literary brilliance, to a certain degree, the paper becomes a victim of journalistic routine. You do not hear at all how the workers live, fight, clash with the police, or drink whiskey. It is very dangerous for the paper as a revolutionary instrument of the party. The task is not to make a paper through the joint forces of a skilled editorial board, but to encourage the workers to speak for themselves. A radical and courageous change is necessary as a condition of success. Of course, it is not only a question of the paper, but of the whole course of policy. I continue to be of the opinion that you have too many petty bourgeois boys and girls who are very good and devoted to the party, but who do not fully realize that these petty bourgeois boys and girls' duty is not to discuss among themselves, but to penetrate into the fresh milieu of workers. I repeat my position. Every petty bourgeois member of the party who, during a certain time, let us say 3 or 6 months, does not win a worker for the party, should be demoted to the rank of candidate and after another 3 months expelled from the party. In some cases it might be unjust, but the party as a whole would receive a salutary shock, which it needs very much. A very radical change is necessary, end quote. In proposing such draconian measures as the expulsion of those petty bourgeois elements incapable of linking themselves to the workers, I had in mind not the, quote, defense, end quote, of Cannon's faction, but the rescue of the party from degeneration. Section 10. Commenting on skeptical voices from the Socialist Workers' Party which had reached my ears, I wrote Comrade Cannon on June 16, 1939, quote, the pre-war situation, the aggravation of nationalism, and so on is a natural hindrance to our development and the profound cause of the depression in our ranks. But it must now be underlined that the more the party is petty bourgeois in its composition, the more the party is dependent upon the changes in the official public opinion. It is a supplementary argument for the necessity for a courageous and active reorientation toward the masses. The pessimistic reasoning you mention in your article are, of course, a reflection of the patriotic nationalistic pressure of the official public opinion. Quote, if fascism is victorious in France, ... end quote. Quote, if fascism is victorious in England, ... end quote, and so on. The victories of fascism are important, but the death agony of capitalism is more important, end quote. Trotsky. The question of the dependence of the petty bourgeois wing of the party upon official public opinion consequently was posed several months before the present discussion began and was not at all dragged in artificially in order to discredit the opposition. ... Shachtman, as we have already seen, persistently demands the citation of precedents. When and where in the past have the leaders of the opposition manifested petty bourgeois opportunism? The reply which I have already given Shachtman on this score must be supplemented here with 2 letters which we sent each other on the question of defensism and methods of defensism in connection with the events of the Spanish Revolution. On the 18th of September 1937, Shachtman wrote me, quote, ... You say, quote, if we would have a member in the Cortes, that's like the parliament in Spain, he would vote against the military budget of Negrin, end quote. Unless this is a typographical error, it seems to us to be non sequitur. If, as we all contend, the element of an imperialist war is not dominant in the present time in the Spanish struggle, and if instead the decisive element is still the struggle between the decaying bourgeois democracy, with all that it involves on the one side, and fascism on the other, and further, if we are obliged to give military assistance to the struggle against fascism, we don't see how it would be possible to vote in the Cortes against the military budget. ... If a Bolshevik Leninist on the Huesca front, were asked by a socialist comrade why his representative in the Cortes voted against the proposal by Negrin to devote 1,000,000 pesetas to the purchase of rifles for the front, what would this Bolshevik Leninist reply? It doesn't seem to us that he would have an effective answer, ... end quote. This letter astounded me. Shachtman was willing to express confidence in the perfidious Negrin government on the purely negative basis that the, quote, element of an imperialist war, end quote, was not dominant in Spain. On the September 20th, 1937, I replied to Shachtman, quote, to vote the military budget of the Negrin government signifies to vote Negrin political confidence. To do it would be a crime. How we explain our vote to the anarchist workers? Very simply, we have not the slightest confidence in the capacity of this government to conduct the war and assure victory. We accuse this government of protecting the rich and starving the poor. This government must be smashed. So long as we are not strong enough to replace it, we are fighting under its command, but on every occasion we express openly our non-confidence in it. It is the only one possibility to mobilize the masses politically against this government and to prepare this government's overthrow. Any other politics would be a betrayal of the revolution, end quote. The tone of my reply only feebly reflects ... the amazement which Shachtman's opportunist position produced in me. Isolated mistakes are, of course, unavoidable, but today, 2.5 years later, this correspondence is illuminated with new light. Since we defend bourgeois democracy against fascism, Shachtman reasons, we therefore cannot refuse confidence to the bourgeois government. In applying this very theorem to the USSR, it is transformed into its converse. Since we place no confidence in the Kremlin government, we cannot therefore defend the workers' state. Pseudo-radicalism in this instance, too, is only the obverse side of opportunism. Again, this piece was labeled A Record of Petty Bourgeois Slidings. It was by Leon Trotsky, 1940. And these are excerpts from Trotsky's From a Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene from January 1940, which was in the book In Defense of Marxism. And that piece, as well as other pieces from In Defense of Marxism, are on this channel. The next piece is labeled Errors of the Whole Socialist Workers' Party, Not Just Us, by the Socialist Workers' Party Minority, 1940. This was published in June 1940 in New International, but dated 9th of March 1940. So I'm assuming this title here was actually the title of the piece as it originally was published. In his open letter to Comrade Trotsky, Comrade Shachtman, repeating the challenge issued by the minority since the moment it was accused of representing a petty bourgeois tendency in the party, declared, quote, ... it is first necessary to prove A. that the minority represents a deviation from the proletarian Marxian line, B. that this deviation is typically petty bourgeois, and C. that it is more than an isolated deviation, it is a tendency. That is precisely what has not been proved." End quote. Comrade Trotsky has been the only one thus far to take up this challenge and to attempt to answer this challenge. Before we deal with Trotsky's answer, a preliminary observation is necessary. Our challenge was addressed in the first place to the Canaanites. If there were a petty bourgeois tendency which had been developing gradually but unmistakably in the party for the past year or two or three, parenthesis, time enough for any tendency to manifest itself, end parenthesis, the ones who would be in an excellent, if not the best position to discern and describe it would be the Canaanites. The Canaanites know the records of the party directly and intimately. The Canaanites know, in particular, the political records of the representative spokesman of the minority. Shachtman wrote of the record of these comrades, quote, "They have one, and, as said above, it is easily available," quote, "They have one, and, as said above, it is easily available. There are the records of the political committee containing the views of all the comrades on every question. There are our articles in the press. There are our programs and manifestos. There are our brochures and speeches. Let them be cited. There has been no lack of bourgeois, patriotic, anti-Soviet, reformist pressure upon our party in the past. Show us from the record when and where any of our leading comrades yielded to this pressure. I say confidently, it cannot be done." End quote. Shachtman. Indeed, it was not done. What is more, Canon, Goldman, and the other majority-ites replied that it need not be done, because they knew it could not be done. Hundreds of comrades who heard him at membership meeting debates recall Canon's statement that Cannon did not charge the minority with having or representing a petty bourgeois tendency prior to the outbreak of the present dispute. In fact, Cannon gave the following, quote, analogy, end quote, with the present fight. Zinoviev and Kamenev had been flawless Bolsheviks, the closest collaborators of Lenin up to April 1917, and suddenly overnight, so to speak, Zinoviev and Kamenev broke from Leninism and became, quote, strikebreakers, end quote. We leave aside here the question of Cannon's ignorance of the historic basis of the petty bourgeois tendency represented in 1917 by Zinoviev and Kamenev. Parenthesis, Trotsky devoted most of his lessons of October to explaining the political roots of what Cannon thinks had no roots in the past, end parenthesis, and emphasized merely the fact that, in Cannon's view, the, quote, petty bourgeois tendency, end quote, had no roots in the past, that it was a sudden, so to speak, an accidental, parenthesis, or episodic phenomenon. As sudden and accidental, parenthesis, in his presentation of the analogy, as the 1917 action of Zinoviev and Kamenev. In other words, it was not a tendency at all. In other words, again, Cannon met our challenge up to recently by denying its validity, by declaring in effect that until the present minority adopted its position on the Russian question, there was no petty bourgeois tendency in the party. Cannon was compelled to put forth this view because Cannon knows that the records of the party and the minority spokesman cannot possibly substantiate any other view. The merit of Trotsky's reply, first, in his recognition of the validity of our challenge, and second, in Trotsky's attempt to substantiate the political characterization of the minority in the only possible and permissible way, namely by producing documentary material dealing with political questions of the past period and the political position taken by various comrades on these questions. In so doing, Trotsky adduces 11 pieces of evidence aimed to prove his point. Before we take up the evidence, it is well to bear in mind that it is bear in mind what it is that has to be proved. To establish that, as against the majority, the political tendency of the minority is petty bourgeois, it's necessary to show concretely and not merely by assertion that in a whole series of political questions in the past period, the representative spokesman of the minority tended to take or did not take a petty bourgeois position, while the representative spokesman of the Cannon faction tended to take or did take the contrary position, that of revolutionary Marxism. With this important point in mind, it will be easier to judge the value of the evidence Trotsky adduces against the minority. We will take it all up, point by point, in order in which it is presented. 1. The policy in the Socialist Party. Trotsky quotes a letter to our faction center in the Socialist Party criticizing the estimate of the situation presented by, quote, A, the private letter of, quote, Max about the convention, and B, Shachtman's article towards a revolutionary socialist party. At best, this is calculated to prove that end quote. At best, this is calculated to prove that Shachtman made an opportunist mistake in 1937, but let us see what this has to do with the political position of the present minority and that of the majority. The, quote, private letter, end quote, signed, quote, Max, was a circular letter sent out to all the Trotskyist groups in the Socialist Party under instructions and with the approval of the entire political committee of our tendency at that time. The same is true of the article by Shachtman in the Socialist Party Monthly Magazine. Let us grant for the moment that the line of these two documents was erroneous and opportunistic, but this line represented the unanimous opinion of the entire faction leadership, with the exception of Burnham. More important, it was the line initiated by Cannon. Here are the facts. On the eve of the Chicago Convention of the Socialist Party, a violent campaign was launched by the right wing to expel us from the party. Cannon was then in California. Cannon hastened to New York to confer with the political committee. Cannon advanced the policy that it was necessary to retreat before the right-wing offensive in order to avoid expulsion, to moderate our tempo and our line. Rightly or wrongly, our political committee agreed with this line, except, we repeat, Burnham, who advocated what might be described as a more aggressive policy. In the political committee, and on the basis of the political committee discipline, Burnham was not granted Burnham's request to present Burnham's own view to the New York membership meeting of the faction. Cannon's main slogan, reporting for the political committee at that meeting, was, quote, we must make a, quote, second entry, end quote, into the Socialist Party, end quote. Every New York comrade who belonged to our group at that time will remember the meeting and the slogan very vividly. Shachtman and others bore the same responsibility as Cannon for this line, not less but not more. It was Cannon who initiated the conversation with Norman Thomas at that time, with the aim of establishing a sort of, quote, truce, which would prevent the right wing from carrying through its drive against us. At the Chicago Convention itself, our delegates' fraction was directed mainly by Cannon and Shachtman. For the political committee, still following the line initiated by Cannon, our delegates were constantly held in check. This was true especially of some of the, quote, natives, end quote, who wanted to make a stiff political fight against the right wing and the Clarityites. I guess Clarity was a guy. The political committee line was to evade the political fight. Our delegates were even instructed to vote for the Clarityite war resolution if our own failed of adoption, as it did. Our delegates were instructed not even to raise the question of the Moscow trials or the endorsement of the American Committee's work. Our delegates were instructed not to make a serious fight for representation on the National Committee of the Socialist Party, and so on. Where did the spokesman of the, quote, proletarian Marxist wing, end quote, differ from the spokesman of the, quote, petty-bourgeois tendency, end quote? Only in that the former initiated the policy pursued, was its principal and most vigorous protagonist, while the latter supported the policy. Using Trotsky's method of proof and criterion, a much better case could be made to, quote, prove, end quote, that Burnham represented the intransigent Marxist line, while Cannon and Shachtman, quote, revealed excessive adaptability towards the left wing of the petty-bourgeois Democrats, end quote. The letter and article of Shachtman were only a continuation of the official policy of the political committee. Trotsky, who opposed it, sought to have it changed as indicated by the letter of May 1937, which Trotsky quotes. Although Trotsky does not quote them, Trotsky's letters to Cannon, who returned to California after the Chicago Convention, also pursued this aim. Cannon subsequently proposed a change in the policy, his own policy, and a new line was finally adopted by the whole political committee, which finally led to the split in the Socialist Party. These are the facts. If Trotsky was unaware of the facts, it was Trotsky's duty to acquaint himself with these facts. Cannon, who was aware of these facts, has taken good care to make no reference in the present dispute to the question of our Socialist Party policy in 1937. The same is true of Goldman, who also knows the facts cited above, as well as a number of other facts. Like every other informed comrade, they know that point 1 in Trotsky's evidence does not even begin to prove his contention about the minority. For remember, Trotsky's task is to prove the existence of a certain tendency in the minority which distinguishes it from the, quote, Marxist, end quote, wing of Cannon. Section 2, the question of workers in the leadership. Trotsky's second point deals with the question of introducing workers into the local and national leadership. Quote, to believe Comrade Shachtman, I dragged the question of the class composition of the factions into the dispute by the hair, end quote. To prove that he did not, he quotes a letter to New York dated October 3rd, 1937. Read the letter. By what single word does it deal with the, quote, class composition of the factions, end quote. It does speak of the need of electing more workers to leadership and points out that, quote, in every organization there are traditional committee members, end quote, and that, quote, different secondary factional and personal considerations play a too great role in the composition of the lists of candidates, end quote. Quite correct. Conclusion, quote, I have never met either attention or interest from Comrade Shachtman in questions of this kind, quote, end quote. From whom has Comrade Trotsky met with attention and interest in questions of this kind? If not from Shachtman of the minority, then perhaps from Cannon? Let us see. At the Chicago founding convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, the list of candidates for the National Committee was prepared mainly by Shachtman, with the knowledge and approval of most of the other leading comrades. At the July 3rd, 1939 convention, 2 lists were presented. Shachtman's for one group of comrades and Dunn's for the Cannon faction, which one was oriented towards the conception of, quote, traditional committee members, end quote, in which one did, quote, secondary factional and personal considerations play a too great role, end quote. An examination of the list can give only one answer, Dunn's slate. Shachtman's slate proposed to introduce a new and fresh element into the National Committee, worker militants like Brightman and qualified youth comrades like Gould and Erbert. There being no important or visible political difference in the party, the slate did not aim at any faction majority. Dunn's slate aimed first and foremost at a majority for the Cannon clique, and towards that end, of retaining some of the, quote, traditional committee members, end quote. Dunn and Lewitt were the 2 spokesmen of the Cannon group for their slate, who were the only 4 individuals on their slate for whom they spoke by name: Clark, Cochran, Morrow, and Stevens, not a single one of them a proletarian, and one of them in particular distinguished by his petty-bourgeois intellectualism, rudeness, and snobbery which repelled any workers' milieu into which he was placed. The July convention dispute was not without significance. The Cannonites talk a good deal about, quote, proletarians in the leadership, end quote, especially on ceremonial occasions or for what the Cannonites consider are good factional ends. The reality is quite different. The actual functioning leadership of the Cannon faction, even though it does not live in the Bronx but in Greenwich Village, does not show any special, quote, interest or attention, end quote, in introducing proletarians into its ranks, unless, parenthesis, we accept such comrades as Lewitt and Brightman, Gordon, Cochran, Clark, Morrow, Wright, Hanson, Goldman, etc., are to be written down as workers. Three, the social composition of the party. In point 3, Trotsky quotes a letter in 1937 to Cannon concerning the poor social composition of the party. He stresses the need of orienting the party membership towards the factories, having each branch or group in each branch concentrate all that branch's forces on 1, 2, or 3 factories in that branch's area. In this way, it would be possible to alter the composition of the party in favor of the proletarian instead of the non-proletarian elements. Good. This letter was addressed to Cannon. Why does not Trotsky conclude on this point, as Trotsky did on point 2, that, quote, I have never met either attention or interest from Comrade Cannon in questions of this kind, end quote. What single proposal did Cannon make in the past 2.5 years with reference to orienting the party and the party's membership towards the factories? wherein was the leader of the, quote, proletarian Marxist wing, end quote, distinguished in this respect from other comrades. When Trotsky wrote to the political committee some time back that a rule should be adopted providing that any non-worker who does not bring a proletarian into the party within 6 months shall himself be reduced to the rank of probationer, McKinney supported the proposal, but no one else, not even Cannon. The latter, Cannon, proposed to send a copy of the letter to the branches without a word of comment, and that is all that was ever heard of the letter, of the proposal, or of Cannon's position on the letter or the proposal. Where does the letter quoted by Trotsky indicate that there was in the party, in Trotsky's opinion, a petty bourgeois tendency peculiar to the present minority? That is what he has set out to prove, but the letter does it in no wise. The social composition of the party as a whole is very poor from the standpoint of a proletarian organization. That is incontestable. But both factions in the present dispute represent in a somewhat greater or lesser extent cross-sections of the party as a whole. The contention that the Cannon faction represents all the proletarian elements in the party, or the bulk of the proletarian elements in the party, and the minority, all or most of the non-proletarian elements, will stand the test of investigation for a single minute. An objective examination of the social composition of the two factions will not show any class preponderance in the ranks or the leadership of either one of them, especially if the party is taken not in an isolated city but as a whole nationally. A similar examination of the social composition of the New York organization, which is indeed far from what it should be, would help to dispel many of the consciously and unconsciously fostered exaggerations and even myths, many of which are so, quote, cleverly, end quote, disseminated by the Cannonites in order to arouse unhealthy prejudices, especially among the newer comrades in the outlying branches. It is true that the Cannonites now show both, quote, attention and interest, end quote, in the question of the social composition of the party, but only because the Cannonites believe that by falsifying the relative composition of the two groups and by demagogical speeches, this, quote, issue, end quote, can be utilized for their factional advantage, especially since they who show an interest in theoretical questions about once every 2 years have been qualified so unexpectedly to themselves as the, quote, Marxist, end quote, wing of the party. Their, quote, attention and interest, end quote, have been displayed before in this question, and in the same way, it seems to suit them as a factional football. They make very solemn speeches about it. As soon as it no longer has a value as a factional issue, is forgotten by them, ... until the next time. Four, the Dewey Commission. Shachtman's failure to, quote, surround, parenthesis, the Dewey, end parenthesis, committee by delegates of workers' groups, end quote, is cited as another piece of, quote, evidence, end quote, that the minority represents a petty bourgeois tendency. This proposal by Trotsky 2 years ago was supported in the political committee by one comrade, McKinney. No other members did. Neither Shachtman nor Burnham nor Cochrane nor Lewitt. Under the circumstances, the committee considered it from the standpoint of practical possibilities and effectiveness and decided that it was not feasible to undertake the formation of such workers' groups. Wherein was the minority distinguished in this question from the majority, or from Cannon in particular? Trotsky does not say, and that for the good reason that he cannot say. The letter from which he quotes was addressed to Cannon, Shachtman, and Novak. What was Cannon's answer to the proposal? The work of the party, and especially of the party leadership, in connection with the Moscow trials and the Dewey Committee, was not, to be sure, flawless. There are many lessons to be learned from our experience in this campaign, especially with respect to liberal Democrats with whom we cooperated. We did not always take advantage of the revolutionary possibilities offered by the situation. At the same time, let it be borne in mind that the problem of the Dewey Committee was not a simple problem, and only special reasons which every comrade will understand prevent us from going into detail of the problem. Yet with all its defects, the campaign we launched around the Moscow trials, parenthesis, at a time when we were half tied and half gagged in the Socialist Party, exclamation point, end parenthesis, was the most successful we ever undertook, a real triumph for the party and the International. Comrade Trotsky played an invaluable part in working out the campaign and in the campaign's success. That goes without saying. But the daily work, elaborating the not always simple policy, directing the work in general, the writing, speaking, and organizing, that had to be done on the spot under the leadership of the political committee. We have no hesitation in saying that a good 80% of the work was done by comrades of the present minority. They feel no reason to be ashamed of or apologetic for that work. Quite the contrary, either organizationally or politically. To ignore all that was accomplished, especially the political gains for our movement, and to reduce everything to the comparatively trifling question of whether or not we carried through the organization of the workers' groups is to abandon all sense of proportion. Here, as in all other cases mentioned in Trotsky's, quote, evidence, end quote, we are prepared, without exempting ourselves from responsibility for mistakes, to match the main line against the incidental error, the great achievement against the episodic shortcoming, the record of political line and activity of our comrades which is known to the party as a whole, and even to the radical public, against the obscure trifles which constitute most of Comrade Trotsky's, quote, proofs, end quote, of our, quote, tendency, end quote. Five, Eastman in the New International. The New International, the magazine. Point 5 is also supposed to prove that the minority represents a petty bourgeois tendency, whereas the majority represents revolutionary Marxism. What is this proof? Not the publication of Eastman's open letter to Corliss Lamont on the Moscow trials. For that is, quote, all right, but the prominence given it on the cover, combined with the silence about Eastman's article in Harper's, end quote. Wikipedia says Corliss Lamont lived from 1902 to 1995. Corliss Lamont was an American socialist and humanist philosopher and advocate of various left-wing and civil liberties causes. As part of Corliss Lamont's political activities, Corliss Lamont was the chairman of National Council of American-Soviet Friendship starting from the early 1940s. End footnote. Or not end footnote, but back to the text. Not the publication of Eastman's open letter to Corliss Lamont on the Moscow trials, for that, quote, is all right, but the prominence given Eastman's open letter to Corliss Lamont on the Moscow trials on the cover, combined with the silence about Eastman's article in Harper's, end quote, Trotsky. The, quote, proofs, end quote, for Trotsky's contention must be scarce indeed to mention this one among them. The size of type used to announce Eastman's article on the cover of the New International was too large. Presumably the Canaanites proposed to use a smaller type, or would have proposed that if the Canaanites could ever be gotten to display any interest in the theoretical organ of the party. But perhaps the prominence given the article on the cover is not the most important point. It is the, quote, silence about Eastman's article in Harper's, end quote. In that case, would it not have been better if only in order to complete the point to indicate that a reply was written to Eastman's article? Who wrote the article? Burnham. On whose direct personal request? Trotsky's. Trotsky knows then, as well as Trotsky knows now, Burnham's position towards Marxian dialectics. Trotsky knew that then the Eastman's Harper article on the end of socialism in Russia was at its point of departure Eastman's particular criticism of Marxian dialectics. In his article on a petty bourgeois opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party on this channel, Trotsky declares that without a Marxian criticism of the opponents of dialectics, it is impossible to expose the essence of the false political position of Eastman, Hooke, and others. If that is so, why did Trotsky propose to Burnham in 1938 that Burnham write a polemical reply to Eastman's Harper article? Why did Trotsky not propose that Cannon or Weber or Wright or Gordon or Cochrane or Morrow write the reply? And why was there no criticism of the reply, parenthesis, and the counter-reply to Eastman's rebuttal, end parenthesis, after Burnham had written it? If it was a satisfactory reply from the standpoint of the party organ, should not Trotsky have mentioned this fact in his point 5? If it was unsatisfactory, why was nothing heard about it, either from Trotsky or anyone else in the party? And above all, where were the spokesmen of the majority in all this, of the Cannonites who represent themselves today as the exclusive defenders of Marxism and dialectics? 6. Eugene Lyons and the banquet. Another point to prove that the minority represents a petty bourgeois tendency is made by Trotsky when Trotsky refers to the fact that, quote, "You are so tolerant, even friendly towards Mr. Eugene Lyons. He speaks, it seems, at your banquets. At the same time, he speaks at the banquets of the White Guards," end quote. To whom does the, quote, "you," end quote, refer? To the minority, perhaps? To Shachtman? What are the facts in this case? The pioneer publishers organized a banquet to which a number of people were invited as speakers in a symposium on the Russian Revolution and Marxism. Eugene Lyons, bracket, the anarchist Carlo Tresca, Wikipedia says that Carlo Tresca, who lived from 1879 to 1943, was an Italian-American dissident and newspaper editor, orator, and labor organizer and activist who was a leader of the industrial workers of the world during the 1910s. Carlo Tresca is remembered as a leading public opponent of fascism, Stalinism, and mafia infiltration of the trade unions for the purpose of labor racketeering and corruption. Born, raised, and educated in Italy, Carlo Tresca was editor of an Italian socialist newspaper and the secretary of the Italian Federation of Railroad Workers before Tresca emigrated to the United States in 1904. After a 3-year spell as secretary of the Italian Socialist Federation of North America, Carlo Tresca joined the industrial workers of the world in 1912 and was involved in strikes across the United States over the rest of the decade. Carlo Tresca was jailed in 1925 after printing a paid advertisement for a birth control pamphlet in one of his newspapers. During the 1930s, Carlo Tresca was a vocal critic of both Benito Mussolini's fascist government in his native Italy and of Joseph Stalin and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In 1937, Carlo Tresca was a member of the Dewey Commission, which cleared Leon Trotsky of all charges made during the Moscow trials. Carlo Tresca also used his newspaper to mount a public campaign criticizing the mafia. Carlo Tresca was assassinated in New York, January 1943, allegedly by Carmine Galante. Who was some mafia thug. Where am I? Back to the text. The pioneer publishers organized a banquet to which a number of people were invited as speakers in a symposium on the Russian Revolution and Marxism. Eugene Lyons, bracket, the anarchist Carlo, and bracket, Tresca, Hooke, Sidney Hooke, and others were among them. The political committee knew nothing about the details of the affair. When the advertisement for the banquet appeared in the Socialist Appeal, Kin and Shachtman discussed the question and took a critical attitude toward the speakers list. The other leading comrades did likewise. The main objection was to the fact that the list was, quote, weighted, end quote, heavily against representatives of revolutionary Marxism. It was decided that Max Shachtman be designated to take the floor at the banquet for the party point of view, and after the brief speeches of the critics of the Russian Revolution, to present the views of the Marxists. This is exactly what Shachtman did, to the satisfaction politically of everyone present, except, of course, the Lyonses and the Hookes. The composition of the speakers list at the banquet was a mistake, for which no member and no group of members of the political committee was responsible. To adduce this miserable incident not for its actual worth, but in order to demonstrate that the minority represents a petty bourgeois tendency, only shows a striking force the weakness, or more accurately the baselessness, of the case which Trotsky is trying to make against us. As against such trivialities, which could be dug up by the dozen if one were interested, can and should be placed the vigorous, effective, and intransigent political campaign in defense of revolutionary Marxism, of the Fourth International, and of the party, and against precisely that type of critic represented by the Eastmans and the Lionses. Trotsky mentions only a yellow leaf here and there, and makes no reference to the big green forest. The defense of the party and the party's program from the Lionses, the education of wide circles of radical workers and intellectuals to the true meaning of the, quote, democratic, end quote, backsliders and renegades, had the representatives of the minority been behindhand in this work in the past. If anything, they have been in the forefront. It is not necessary to institute an objective re-examination of the record as a whole, instead of taking up isolated, insignificant incidents of fugitive importance. The party needs no such re-examination for the simple reason that the record is already common knowledge. And if there were such a re-examination, it would reveal that it is the Canaanites, more than anyone else, who showed a complete indifference to the defense of the party program and of Marxism on the theoretical front. Except for one article by Goldman and another by Wright, the Canaanite leadership is represented by a blank space in the past 2-3 years of struggle against precisely that tendency in and around the radical labor movement, which is represented variously by Sidney Hook, Max Eastman, Eugene Lyons, Stolberg, etc., etc. Has Trotsky failed to notice this fact? Has Trotsky failed to call attention to it in the proper quarters? In any case, the party in general has noticed it and has drawn the necessary conclusions, except for factional considerations. Except for factional considerations, the, quote, normal, end quote, interest of the Canaanites, Canon in particular in theoretical questions of Marxism, is distinguished by its absence. The, quote, practical, end quote, leader leaves that to the, quote, intellectuals, end quote. 789, the Socialist Appeal. It is not necessary to dwell on the defects of the Socialist Appeal in this document. They are not unknown to the party. On the basis of criticisms of the appeal made by Trotsky and comrades in the American Party, on the basis of many direct experiences, on the basis of criticism of many readers of the paper, these criticisms, without proposals for improving the paper, were incorporated in the report to the July Convention delivered by Comrade Aburn and in the remarks of Morrow, Shachtman, and many other delegates. However, to refer to the defects of the appeal for the purpose of characterizing either one of the factions in the party, or any group of comrades, or any individual comrade, is totally absurd. The problem of the appeal is, and always has been, and most likely always will be, the problem of the party itself. The official organ of the party can, so to speak, rise above the party to a certain extent, as has been pointed out on more than one occasion, but it cannot reflect the class struggle in the country to a radically different degree than the one to which the struggle is participated in by the party itself. On more than one occasion, the editorial staff made efforts to organize a network of worker correspondents for the appeal, and it succeeded in a modest measure. If the success was far from what is desirable and necessary, it is, as was recognized by all comrades in many discussions, due basically to the detachment of the party as a whole, with isolated exceptions, from the political life and the life of the working class of the country. It is at bottom only to the extent that the entire party enters into the political life of the country, into the life and movements of the working class, that the, quote, face, end quote, and contents of the appeal will be altered in the right direction. But it is precisely at this point that the criticism of the minority shows its validity. The criticism of the bureaucratic conservatism that characterizes the Canon faction, the analysis of the minority, quote, war and bureaucratic conservatism, end quote, replete with facts that are easily verifiable, where they are not already common party knowledge, has not been refuted to the present day. The attempt to dispose of the indictment of the Canon regime by a few sarcastic remarks in passing would not serve as refutation. 10. Again, the social composition. Trotsky quotes also from a letter to Cannon on the 16th of June 1939 on the poor social composition of the party and its consequent greater liability to the pressure of the quote, its consequent greater liability to the pressure of quote official public opinion, end quote. Where is this point of proof of the charge that the minority group represents a petty bourgeois tendency? In quoting his letter to prove his charge, Trotsky assumes that which he is attempting to prove, namely that the Cannon group is the group of the proletariat in the party, and the minority the group of the petty bourgeois, the group of the petty bourgeois. But this is just what it is impossible to demonstrate on the basis of the facts. In the first place, even if this division corresponded to reality, and we deny it, it would be necessary to emphasize that it would not have the same significance in our tiny organization that it has in a mass party of tens or hundreds of thousands which, because it is deep in the turbulent streams of the class struggle, is directly affected by the changes of the prevailing current. In general, the smaller the organization, the less rooted it is in the classes, the less accurately it reflects social forces and pressures. In the second place, even if this division corresponded to reality, again, we deny it, it would be necessary to examine the actual situation, not so much in terms of generalities, not so much in terms of what holds true, quote, in the long run, in the final analysis, end quote, but in terms of what is demonstrable in the given dispute, of what is shown by concrete experience. The social composition of the Revolutionary Party is decisive in the long run, for the quite obvious reason that the working class is the decisive and only consistently progressive class in modern society, that the working class alone can lead the struggle for socialism. The social composition of the Revolutionary Party is decisive immediately, in this sense that the Revolutionary Party, regardless of its social composition, at its formation or at any given stage, must constantly strive to become a proletarian party. It must orient itself mainly towards the working class. It would, however, be erroneous to make the arbitrary deduction from this that at any given stage and in any political dispute, what that party or group in a party which is predominantly proletarian in its composition is correct in its political standpoint, as against another party or group whose social composition is, from the proletarian viewpoint, inferior. Such a conclusion would have meant, as we know from the past, the capitulation on more than one occasion of the revolutionary Marxist tendency to the reformist tendency, specifically in the Russian Social Democratic Party, where the Mensheviks at times had by far the greater number of proletarians in their ranks compared with the Bolsheviks. The problem then boils down, as it always does fundamentally, to the question of the political position, as it does in the present dispute, and there it is necessary to decide objectively on whether victory of Stalin's annexationist army in Finland, for example, or the struggle for the development of the independent class activity of the third camp is the correct position, the one that really represents the interests of the proletarian revolution. The triumphant reference of the Cannonites to the fact that the Minneapolis branch, for example, supports the majority with such remarkable unanimity, too, does not decide for a minute the correctness or incorrectness of their political position. There is no smaller number of proletarian militants in other sections of the party who support the standpoint of the minority. But even if this were not true, and its truth is easily demonstrated, it would not be as decisive precisely from the standpoint of social composition and class pressures, as the fact which we consider to be much more decisive and significant to the present dispute, namely the fact that the overwhelming majority of the youth comrades support the minority. The youth, with all the deficiencies that characterize the youth, are precisely the ones who, more than any other single stratum in the party, are the best barometers in the present discussion. The young comrades who make up our youth movement are, by and large, quite different from the elements who made up the revolutionary youth organizations in the past, say 10, 15 years ago. They are literally the vanguard of the, quote, locked-out generation, end quote. In the past, many of the youth aspired and even had the possibility to, quote, lift, end quote, themselves out of the working class to become part of the bourgeois or petty bourgeois world, lawyers, doctors, teachers, members of the, quote, liberal professions, end quote, or even, quote, better, end quote. Their conduct in the movement corresponded to this aspiration. Thus, their constant conflicts with the party, parenthesis, we speak of the early days of the Communist Party in the USA, end parenthesis, were most often based on their resistance to the party's demands for activity in the class struggle, in the political life of the country, to the party's demands for sacrifices, etc. The youth of our party differs radically in every respect, with few exceptions. The youth of our party have no illusions about the possibilities for, quote, rising in the world, end quote, of American capitalism today. The youth have a deep attachment to the movement based on far more than intellectual reasons. It is not comfort they seek, but struggle. The war question to them is not an abstraction, but a reality. It is most significant that their conflicts with the party in the past 2 years have been based precisely on their criticism, substantially if not always justified, of the party leadership's tendency to do nothingness, to routinism, to lack of initiative, to lack of planned and systematic activity. It is most significant that in Cannon's pre-convention articles in the Appeal, Cannon attacked the youth comrades not for, quote, petty-bourgeois dilettantism, end quote, or for, quote, opportunism, end quote, or for, quote, inactivity, end quote, or for, quote, refusing to get into action, end quote, but rather in the opposite sense of their alleged, quote, adventurism and, quote, leftism, end quote. The youth of our movement in this country are immature in many respects. They have not gone through many indispensable experiences. They have not passed all the tests, but in the present party dispute they passed the test of the war crisis and the problems posed by the war crisis far, far better than did the Cannon clique. To try to pass off the strong support which the youth have given to the minority with the argument that it is most susceptible to, quote, bourgeois democratic and patriotic pressure, end quote, can be put down either to ignorance of the real composition and sentiments of the bulk of our youth, or at best to sheer rationalization. One last point may be made here. The self-styled, quote, proletarian, end quote, wing of the party claims Minneapolis and the Siemens fraction as the self-styled, quote, proletarian wing, end quote, of the party's citadels. Let us grant that for the moment it is correct. It claims also, the self-styled, quote, proletarian wing of the party claims also that the Soviet Union has been under the attack of imperialism for the past 6 months, and particularly now in the war in Finland, claims too that the United States is also engaged in an imperialist attack on the Soviet Union. What social pressure has thus far prevented the majority, completely in control of the party apparatus, from issuing a single leaflet to the American seamen, to the longshoremen, calling upon them to refuse to load or sail ships with material for Finland and its backers, and to load and sail ships with material for the Soviet Union? What social pressure has prevented the raising of this concrete slogan, even in the columns of the Appeal since the war began? What social pressure has prevented the comrades in Minnesota, heavily populated by Finnish and Scandinavian workers, from issuing a leaflet explaining in simple but clear terms that we are not only for the defeat of the Mannerheim army in Finland, but that we are for the victory of the Red Army? The minority has asked this question for months. The answer is still to be heard. 11. Negrin's military budget. One of Trotsky's trump cards, so to speak, is the exchange of letters between Trotsky and Shachtman on the question of voting for the military budget of Negrin in the Loyalist Cortes. Let us grant that Shachtman's position on this question was entirely wrong. But in whose name did Shachtman write his letter of inquiry? The letter speaks of, quote, we and, quote, us. The, quote, we and, quote, us refer to most of the comrades of the political committee. Upon receiving Trotsky's 1937 article in which Trotsky said that we would not vote for the Loyalist military budget, Cannon and Shachtman, among others, could not believe that this was Trotsky's position. This may not speak well for their political development, but it is the fact. It was decided that Shachtman write Trotsky about it, not in his name alone, but in the name of Cannon and the others. The, quote, opportunist position, end quote, which Trotsky attributes to Shachtman alone, in an attempt to prove a continuity of line of the minority, was the position of Cannon and other leading comrades of the party. In this, as in so many of the other cases noted above, Trotsky tries in vain to separate that which was inseparable. It may be argued, after all this, that Trotsky does nevertheless prove that for the past 2-3 years, Trotsky constantly called attention to the dangers and mistakes of a petty bourgeois tendency that existed in general in the party, and that by its present position in the Russian question, the minority shows itself to be the clearest expression of this tendency. In the first place, what was necessary to prove was that the minority, on a series of political questions in the past, took or tended to take a petty bourgeois position on these questions, as against the Canaanites, who took or tended to take the Marxist position. Even if Trotsky is granted all Trotsky's points, they would at best show that, on the whole, the position of both the majority and the minority was the same in the 11 cases he mentions. The distinction between the two groups first occurs clearly on the Russian question. It is therefore necessary to demonstrate how, on the Russian question, the position of the minority is petty bourgeois, but this is no easy matter. At least it has not yet been done, and in our opinion cannot be done. In the second place, we contend that by Trotsky's method of selection, one could, quote, prove, end quote, almost anything about the tendency of the two groups. Out of 2-3 years of the political record of the party and its leadership, Trotsky has taken a number of isolated instances in which he adopted a critical attitude, and then quite arbitrarily after the fact, he makes the present minority the object of that criticism. Trotsky writes, quote, "Let Shachtman not object that the lapses and mistakes in which the correspondence is concerned likewise can be brought against other comrades, including representatives of the present majority, possibly, probably, but Shachtman's name is not repeated in this correspondence accidentally," end quote. But why should we not object? Whether or not Cannon's name is mentioned as often as Shachtman's, parenthesis, it is, end parenthesis, is besides the point. What is important is that, as has been demonstrated above, what applied to one comrade applied at least as well to many others, to the majority as well as to the minority. Why is it not just as legitimate to say today, quote, Cannon's present position on the Russian question is the logical flowering of the petty bourgeois tendency Cannon showed on the question of Negrin's military budget, of the Socialist Party tactic, of the Eastman letter, of the Socialist appeal, etc., end quote. To answer, quote, but it is not. It is the Marxian position, end quote, is merely an assertion which is made just as vigorously by the minority. The conflicting assertions have to be examined objectively. The arguments have to be judged on their merits. The fact that Cannon and Shachtman or Goldman and Burnham took the same position on political questions in the past does not prove that one of them represents a different tendency today. In the third place, even if it were granted that in every one of the 11 cases Trotsky's criticism was valid, and that it applies to Shachtman or even to all the leaders of the minority exclusively, as against the majority leaders, it would still be necessary to ask, what importance have all these cases, including the invitation of Lyons to the Pioneer Banquet and the prominence given to Eastman's article on the cover of the New International, in comparison with the known record of these comrades and all other political problems facing the party in the past period? The struggle for the Fourth International and the Fourth International's program, the defense from all varieties of Democrats, Social Democrats, Stalinists, sectarians, and others did not begin a couple of months ago when Cannon discovered that Burnham was not a defender of dialectics. It has been going on in the party for some time. We repeat, the record of the leaders of the minority in the struggle to build the Fourth International and to defend the Fourth International's program, above all in the question of war and bourgeois patriotism, is well known, and it is not worse than the record of other comrades. Can it so easily be forgotten or wiped out even by all the 11, quote, proofs, end quote, cited by Trotsky, even if they were multiplied by 2? That, too, will not be so easy. For the party to try to deny this record would be to deny itself. Our characterization of the political tendency represented by the Cannon clique has only been denied, but never refuted. Not even the attempt has been made. To our challenge to show the development of the, quote, petty bourgeois tendency, end quote, from the political record of the minority in the past, only Comrade Trotsky replied, although one would suppose that our most immediate collaborators, the Cannonites, who know that record intimately, should have been the first to meet the challenge by drawing on that knowledge. Not a single one of Trotsky's 11, quote, proofs, end quote, have been evaded in our answer, which shows the utter groundlessness of the political characterization which Trotsky has attempted to attach to the minority. The charge remains unproved because there is no proof for the charge. The end of that piece, which is titled "The Errors of the Whole Socialist Workers' Party, Not Just Us," which was published in New International June 40th, but was dated originally as 9th of March, 1940. Did I say? I think I said something wrong. New International, June 1940, dated 9th of March, 1940. The next section is titled, is labeled "Class Struggle Within the Party?" by Martin Aburn, Paul Byrne, James Burnham, and Max Shachtman. It's from 1940. This says it's from the 1939 to 40 opposition document, The War and Bureaucratic Conservatism, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 6, January 1940. The bracket fourth end bracket theory of canon is as follows. The present dispute in the party is the expression of a conflict between the petty bourgeois middle class elements, parenthesis, the minority, end parenthesis, and the proletarian elements, parenthesis, the majority, end parenthesis. A luscious and satisfying theory indeed. What we, the majority, say to itself, licking its chops, have in the party is the class struggle. Thus, the majority can get compensation by participation in, quote, its own, end quote, class struggle for the party's inadequacies in the real struggle which is proceeding in its own way in the outside world. This theory also is not political but sociological. If it were true and significant, it would still be necessary to characterize the position reached by the, quote, petty bourgeois current, end quote, politically. It is not enough just to call it, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote. Now, in the first place, this theory, even if it were significant and relevant as it is not true, even as a description of the facts, quite apart from their interpretation. We do not miss, quote, petty bourgeois elements, end quote, prominently in the canon faction in many localities, we do not miss, quote, petty bourgeois elements, end quote, prominently in the canon faction in many localities from Boston to the Pacific coast, to above all the national center. If we really think it worthwhile to speak of social status, we must remember that it is not altered by learning to speak out of the side of one's mouth, to smoke large cigars, to sprinkle one's speeches with resounding cuss words. We are the first to admit that the social composition of our party, above all our party's lack of genuine proletarians, is a tragic weakness, and that all justifiable means must be used to overcome this weakness. We find, however, that this has been a weakness of the entire Fourth Internationalist movement, and in fact of wide sections of the revolutionary movement from its inception. We do not expect, therefore, to solve it in a day or by an easy formula. Quote, pursue a correct Marxian policy, translate our views into terms understandable by the masses, participate directly in the mass movement along this line, end quote, is the only, quote, formula, end quote, we know, and it is not an easy formula. The revolutionary program is not the spontaneous or automatic product of the proletarians themselves. The, quote, natural, end quote, proletarian policy is reformist or syndicalist. Indeed, from at least one most important point of view, the most radical influence in our party is the youth, the disinherited generation who above all have, quote, nothing to lose but their chains, end quote, and their hopeless social situation. And the youth is in its overwhelming bulk against Cannon and Cannon's policies and Cannon's regime. Cannon's, quote, class struggle, end quote, theory of the party crisis is a very dangerous fraud. Cannon's, quote, class struggle theory of the party crisis' concrete meaning is to encourage the trade union communists to free themselves, not from, quote, petty bourgeois elements, end quote, but from political control by the party. The talk about, quote, petty bourgeois elements, end quote, serves them as a rationalization to excuse rejection of political control by the party when that control seems to parenthesis, and sometimes necessarily does, end parenthesis, interfere with local or temporary advantages in trade union work. In this fundamental respect, it is identical with the, quote, theory, end quote, and agitation of the Foster faction in the Communist Party years ago, often condemned by our movement in the past and meriting the same condemnation today. Again, that piece was labeled Class Struggle Within the Party by Martin Aburn, Paul Byrne, James Burnham, Max Shachtman, 1940. And it's from the 1939 opposition document titled The War and Bureaucratic Conservatism, Socialist Workers' Party International Bulletin, Volume 2, Number 6, January 1940. The next piece is titled Trade Unionists and Revolutionists by James P. Cannon, and it's from 1953. It was published in Fourth International, Spring 1954, and is abridged. In 1953, the Socialist Workers' Party had a faction fight. I guess this is like an introduction here. It seems like it's an introduction. I'm not sure. In 1953, the Socialist Workers' Party had a faction fight after which it expelled at least a third of the organization, including Bert Cochran, George Clark, Harry Braverman, and most of the Socialist Workers' Party's more established trade unionists. This article is an abridged transcript of a speech by Cannon to a majority faction meeting, in which Cannon shows that political groupings in a revolutionary socialist party cannot be evaluated just by tagging them as, quote, petty-bourgeois or, quote, proletarian, end quote. Oh, that's good. The real social composition of the party is by no means uniform. It reflects some of the changes which have taken place in the American working class. This has been strikingly demonstrated by the lineup of the party trade unionists in our factional struggle. The revolutionists among them, the big majority on the one side, and the conservatized elements, a small minority on the other, have chosen different sides instinctively and almost automatically. Since the consolidation of the CIO unions, bracket, the mass industrial unions dating from the 1930s, before then unions in the USA were mostly craft unions or more skilled workers, end bracket, and the 13-year period of war and post-war boom, a new stratification has taken place within the American working class, and particularly and conspicuously in the CIO unions. Our party, which is rooted in the unions, reflects that stratification too. The worker who has soaked up the general atmosphere of the long prosperity and begun to live and think like a petty bourgeois is a familiar figure in the country at large. He has even made his appearance in the Socialist Workers' Party as a ready-made recruit for an opportunist faction. In our 1952 convention resolution, we explained the situation in the American working class as a whole in the two sections, quote, the causes of labor conservatism and the premises for a new radicalization, end quote. And, quote, perspectives of a new radicalization, end quote. In my report of the National Convention, I called those two sections, quote, the heart of the resolution, end quote, and centered my report around them. It appears to me now, in the light of the conflict in the party and its real causes, which are now manifest, that those sections of the Convention resolution dealing with the class as a whole require further elaboration and amplification. We need a more precise examination of the stratifications within the working class, which are barely touched here, and of the projection of these stratifications in the composition of the unions, in the various inter-union tendencies, and even in our own party. This, I believe, is the key to the otherwise inexplicable riddle of why one proletarian section of the party, even though it is a small minority, supports a capitulatory opportunist faction against the proletarian revolutionary line and the leadership of the party. This apparent contradiction, this division of working class forces in party factional struggle is not new. In the classical faction struggles of our international movement since the time of Marx and Engels, there's always been a division in the party itself between the different strata of worker. The proletarian left wing by no means ever had all the workers, and the opportunist petty bourgeois wing was never without some working class support, that is, working class in the technical sense of wage workers. The revisionist intellectuals and the trade union opportunists always nestled together in the right wing of the party. In the Socialist Workers' Party at the present time, we have a repetition of the classical lineup that characterized the struggle of left and right in the Second International before the First World War. Trotsky told us on one of our visits with Trotsky, I think he also wrote it somewhere, that there was a real social division between the two factions of the original Social Democratic Party of Russia, which later became separate parties. The Mensheviks, he said, had nearly all the intellectuals. With a few exceptions, the only intellectuals Lenin had were those whom the party had trained, a good deal like our own worker intellectuals for the greater part. The intellectual, I mean the professional intellectual of the Burnham type, the man from the professor's chair from the universities, was a rarity on Lenin's side, whereas the Mensheviks had shoals of them. In addition, the Mensheviks had most of the skilled workers, who were always the privileged workers. The printers' union was Menshevik even through the revolution. The railroad workers' bureaucracy tried to paralyze the revolution. It was only by military force and the aid of a minority that the Bolsheviks were able to prevent the Menshevik railroad workers' officialdom from employing their strategic position against the revolution. Trotsky said that the Mensheviks also had most of the older workers. Age, as you know, is associated with conservatism. Parenthesis, in general, that is, but not always. There are exceptions to the rule. There are two different ways of measuring age. In ordinary life, you measure age by the calendar, but in revolutionary politics, you measure age by the mind and the will and the spirit. You don't always get the same result, in parenthesis. On the other hand, while the older workers, the skilled and the privileged, were with the Mensheviks, the unskilled workers and the youth were with the Bolsheviks, that is, those of them who were politicized. That was the line of division between the factions. It was not merely a question of the arguments and the program, it was the social impulses, petty-bourgeois on one side, proletarian on the other, which determined their allegiance. The same lineup took place in Germany. The pre-war German social democracy in its heyday had a powerful bloc of opportunist parliamentarians, Marxologists who utilized their scholastic training and their ability to quote Marx by the yard to justify an opportunist policy. They were supported not merely by the petty shopkeepers, of whom there were many, and the trade union bureaucrats. They also had a solid base of support in the privileged stratum of the aristocracy of labor in Germany. The trade union opportunists in the German Social Democratic Party supported Bernstein's revisionism without bothering to read his articles. They didn't need to read them, they just felt that way. The most interesting facts on this point are cited by Peter Gay in his book on Bernstein and his revisionist movement, entitled The Dilemma of Democratic Socialism. All through the pre-war fight over revisionism, then through the war and post-war days, through 1923 and 1933, the skilled, privileged trade unionists were the solid base of support of the opportunist social democratic leaders, while the communist revolutionaries from the time of Liebknecht and Luxemburg all the way down to the fascist catastrophe in 1933 were the youth, the unemployed, and the unskilled, less privileged workers. If you will go back and read Lenin again, in case you've forgotten it, you will see how Lenin explained the degeneration of the Second International and its eventual betrayal in the First World War, precisely by its opportunism based upon the adaptation of the party to the conservative impulses and demands of the bureaucracy and aristocracy of labor. We had the same thing in the U.S., although we never had a social democracy in the European sense, and the working class was never politically organized here as it was there. The organized labor movement up to the 1930s was largely restricted to a privileged aristocracy of labor, as Debs and De Leon used to call it, of skilled craftsmen, who got better wages and had preferred conditions, quote, job trust, end quote, and so on. The chief representative of this conservative privileged craft union stratum was Samuel Gompers. On the other side, there was the great mass of the basic proletariat, the unskilled and semi-skilled, the mass production workers, the foreign-born, and the jobless youth. They were without benefit of organization, without privileges, the outcasts of society. It was not without reason that they were more radical than the others. Nobody paid any attention to them except the revolutionists and radicals. Only the IWW of Haywood and St. John, Debs, and the left socialists voiced their bitter grievances, did the organizing work, and led the strikes of the mass production workers in those days. If the official labor bureaucracy intervened in the spontaneous strikes of the unorganized, it was usually to break them up and to sell them out. The officials of the skilled unions did not welcome the great upsurge of the unorganized workers in the 1930s, but they could not prevent it. When the spontaneous strikes and drives for organization could no longer be ignored, the American Federation of Labor began to assign, quote, organizers, end quote, to the various industries, steel, rubber, auto, etc. The AFL were sent, however, the quote, organizers were sent, however, not to lead the workers in a struggle, but to control the workers, to prevent the consolidation of self-acting industrial unions. They actually wouldn't permit the auto workers in convention to elect their own officials, insisting that the AFL appoint them, quote, provisionally, end quote. The same with the rubber workers and other new industrial unions. These new unions had to split with the conservative labor fakers of the American Federation of Labor before they could consolidate unions of their own. The drives behind the 1934 to 37 upsurge were the bitter and irreconcilable grievances of the workers, their protest against mistreatment, speed up insecurity, the revolt of the pariahs against the pariah status. This revolt, which no bureaucracy could contain, was spearheaded by new people, the young mass production workers, the new young militants whom nobody had ever heard of. They were the real creators of the CIO. This revolt of the, quote, men from nowhere, end quote, reached its high tide in the sit-down strikes of 1937. The workers' victory in these definitely established the CIO and secured stability of the new unions through the seniority clause. It is now 16 years since the sit-down strikes made the new CIO union secure by the seniority clause. These 16 years of union security and 13 years of uninterrupted war and post-war prosperity have wrought a great transformation in the unprivileged workers who made the CIO. The seniority clause, like everything else in life, has revealed a contradictory quality. By regulating the rights to employment through time of service on the job, it secures the union militant against arbitrary discrimination and layoffs. It is an absolute necessity for union security. That is the position of the seniority clause. But at the same time, it has also gradually creates a sort of special interest in the form of steadier employment for those unionists who have been longest in the shop. That is its negative side. In time, with the stretching out of their seniority rights and their upgrading to better jobs, a process of transformation in the status of the original union militants has taken place. In the course of 16 years, they have secured more or less steady employment, even in times of slack work. They are, under the rules, the last to be laid off and the first to be rehired, and in most cases, they have better jobs than newcomers to the shop. All of this, combined with war and post-war prosperity, has changed their material position and to a certain extent their social status. The pioneer militants of the CIO unions were 16 years older than they were in 1937. They are better off than the ragged and hungry sit-down strikers of 1937, and many of them are 16 times softer and more conservative. The privileged section of the unions, formerly the backbone of the left wing, is today the main social base of the conservative Reuther bureaucracy. They are convinced far less by Reuther's clever demagogy than by the fact that Reuther really articulates their own conservatized moods and patterns of thought. But these conservatized ex-militants are only part of the membership of the CIO, and I don't think that our resolution at the convention deals specifically and adequately with that fact. In these mass production industries, which are real slave pens and hellholes, there are many others. There is a mass of younger workers who have none of these benefits and privileges and no vested interest in the piled-up seniority rights. They are the human material for the new radicalism. The Revolutionary Party, looking to the future, must turn its primary attention to them. If we If we, counting on a new upsurge in the labor movement, look to those who led it 16 years ago, we could indeed draw a gloomy picture. Not only are they not in a radical mood now, they're not apt to become the spearhead of a new radicalization. They will take youth and hunger and raggedness. That will take youth and hunger and raggedness and bitter discontent with all the conditions of life. We must look to the new people if, as I take it, we are thinking in terms of the coming American Revolution and not limiting our vision to the prospect of a new shake-up in the bureaucracy and of caucus combinations with slick, quote, progressive, end quote, fakers for little aims. This new stratification in the new unions is a feature which the party can no longer ignore. All the more so since we now see it directly reflected in our party. A number of party members in the auto union belong to this privileged upper stratum. That's the first thing you have to recognize. Some of the best militants, the best stalwarts of the party in the old times have been affected by the changed conditions of their own lives and by their new environment. They see the old militants in the unions who formerly cooperated with them growing slower, more satisfied, more conservative. They still mix with these ex-militants socially and are infected by them. They develop a pessimistic outlook from the reactions they get on every side from these old-timers, and unknown to themselves acquire an element of that same conservatism. That, in my opinion, is the reason why they support a crudely conservative, pessimistic, capitulatory tendency in our internal faction fight. This, I am afraid, is not a misunderstanding on their part. I wish it were, for in that case our task would be easy. The miserable arguments of the Cochranites cannot stand up against Marxist criticism, provided one accepts the criteria of revolutionary Marxism. But that's the rub. Our conservatized trade unions no longer accept this criteria. Like many others who, quote, used to be radicals themselves, end quote, our conservatized trade unionists are beginning to talk about our, quote, theses on the American Revolution, end quote, as a, quote, crackpot, end quote, idea. They don't, quote, feel, end quote, that way, and nobody can talk them out of the way they do feel. That, and perhaps a guilty conscience, is the true explanation of their subjectivity, their rudeness and factional frenzy when one tries to argue with them from the principled standpoint of the, quote, old Trotskyism, end quote. They do not fall on Cochrane out of exceptional regard for Cochrane personally because they know Cochrane. They simply recognize in Cochrane, with his capitulatory defeatism and his program of retreat from the fighting arena to a propaganda circle, the authentic spokesman of their own mood of retreat and withdrawal. Just as the older, more skilled and privileged German trade unionists supported the right against the left, and as their Russian counterparts supported the Mensheviks against the Bolsheviks, the, quote, professional trade unionist, end quote, in our party, end quote, the, quote, professional trade unionists, end quote, in our party support Cochranism in our fight, and for the same basic reasons. I, for my part, must frankly admit that I did not see this whole picture at the beginning of the fight. I anticipated that some tired and pessimistic people who were looking for some sort of rationalization to slow down or get out of the struggle would support any kind of an opposition faction that would arise. That happens in every faction fight. But I didn't anticipate the emergence of a conservatized worker stratum serving as an organized grouping and a social basis for an opportunist faction in the party. Still less did I expect to see such a grouping strutting around in the party demanding special consideration because they are, quote, trade unionists, end quote. What's exceptional about that? There are 15 million trade unionists in this country, but not quite so many revolutionists. But the revolutionists are the ones who count with us. The revolutionary movement under the best conditions is a hard fight. And the revolutionary movement wears out a lot of human material. Not for nothing has the revolutionary movement been, not for nothing has it been said 1,000 times in the past, quote, the revolution is a devourer of men, end quote. The movement in this, the richest and most conservative country in the world, is perhaps the most voracious of all. It's not easy to persist in the struggle, to hold on, to stay tough and fight the struggle out year after year without victory, and even in times such as the present without tangible progress. That requires theoretical conviction and historical perspective as well as character. And in addition to that, it requires association with others in a common party. The surest way to lose one's fighting faith is to succumb to one's immediate environment, to see things only as things are and not as things are changing and must change, to see only what is before one's eyes and imagine that what is before one's eyes is permanent. That is the cursed fate of the trade unionist who separates the trade unionist self from the revolutionary party. In normal times, the trade union, by the trade union's very nature, is a culture broth of opportunism. No trade unionist, overwhelmed by the petty concerns and limited aims of the day, can retain his vision of the larger issues and the will to fight for them without the party. The Revolutionary Party can make mistakes, and has made mistakes, but it is never wrong in the fight against grievance mongers who try to blame the party for their own weaknesses, for their tiredness, their lack of vision, their impulse to quit and to capitulate. The party is not wrong when it calls this tendency by its right name. People often act differently as individuals and give different explanations for their actions than when they act and speak as groups. When an individual gets tired and wants to quit, he usually says he is tired and he quits, or he just drops out without saying anything at all, and that's all there is to it. That has been happening in our international movement for 100 years. But when the same kind of people decide as a group to get out of the line of fire by getting out of the party, they need the cover of a faction and a, quote, political, end quote, rationalization. Any, quote, political, end quote, explanation will do, and in any case it is pretty certain to be a phony explanation. That also has been going on for about 100 years. The present case of the Cockernite trade unionists is no exception to this rule. Out of the clear sky we hear that some, quote, professional trade unionists, end quote, are suddenly against us because we are, quote, Stalinophobes, end quote, and they are hell-bent on an orientation towards Stalinism. Why, that's the damnedest nonsense I ever heard. They had never had that idea in their heads until this fight started. How could they? The Stalinists have gotten themselves isolated in the labor movement, and it's poison to touch them. To go looking for the Stalinists is to cut yourself off from the labor movement, and these party, quote, trade unionists, end quote, don't want to do that. The people in Michigan who are hollering for us to make an orientation towards the Stalinists have no such orientation on their own home grounds, and they're perfectly right about that. I don't deny that people like Clark, Bartell, and Frankel, bracket Braverman, end bracket, have heard voices and seen visions of a gold mine hidden in the Stalinist hills. I will discuss this hallucination at another time, but the Cockernite trade unionists haven't the slightest intention of going prospecting there. They are not even looking in that direction. What's amazing is the insincerity of their support of the orientation towards the Stalinists. That's completely artificial for factional purposes. No, you have to say the orientation towards Stalinism, as far as the Michigan trade unionists are concerned, is a phony. What is the next thing we hear? That they are full of, quote, grievances against the party, quote, regime, end quote. I always get suspicious when I hear of grievances, especially from people whom you didn't hear it from before. When I see people revolting against the party on the ground that they've been badly treated by this terrible regime in our party, which is actually the fairest, most democratic and easygoing regime in the history of the human race, I always remind myself of the words of J. Pierpont Morgan. He said, quote, everybody has at least two reasons for what he does, a good reason and the real reason, end quote. They've given a good reason for their opposition. Now I want to know what the hell is the real reason. It can't be the party's hostility to Stalinism, as they say, because the Cockernite trade unionists wouldn't touch the Stalinists with a 10-foot pole, not even if you stood behind the Cockernite trade unionists with bayonets and lighted firecrackers under their coattails. It can't be the Third World Congress, bracket, of the Fourth International in 1951, end bracket, concerning which they are suddenly working up a lather. These comrades in Michigan have many admirable qualities, as has been shown in the past, but they're by no means the most internationalist-minded section of the party, not by far. They're not that section of the party most interested in theoretical questions. The Detroit branch, sad to say, has been most remiss in the teaching and study of Marxist theory, and is not paying a terrible price for it. This branch hasn't got a single class going, no class in Marxism, no class in party history, no class on the Third World Congress or anything else. So when they suddenly erupt with the demand that the Third World Congress be nailed to the party's masthead, I say that's another good reason, but it's a phony too. The real reason is that they're in revolt against the party without fully knowing why. For the young militant, the party is a necessity valued above everything else. The party was the very life of these militants, and when they were young and really militant. The party was the very life of these militants when they were young and really militant. These militants didn't care for jobs. These militants feared no hazards. Like any other first-class revolutionist, these militants would quit a job at the drop of a hat if the party wanted them to go to another town, wanted them to do this or that. It was always the party first. The party is the highest prize to the young trade unionist who becomes a revolutionist, the apple of his eye. But to the revolutionist who becomes transformed into a trade unionist, we have all seen this happen more than once. The party is no prize at all. The mere trade unionist who thinks in terms of, quote, union politics, end quote, and, quote, power blocks, end quote, and little caucuses with little fakers to run for some little office, pushing one's personal interest here and there, why should he belong to a revolutionary party? For such a person, the party is a millstone around his neck, interfering with his success as a, quote, practical, end quote, trade union politician. And in the present political situation in the country, it's a danger in the union, in the shop, and in life in general. The great majority of the party trade unionists understand all this as well as we do. The vulgar, quote, trade unionist, end quote, appeal of the Cochranites only repels them, for they consider themselves to be revolutionists first and trade unionists second. In other words, they are party people, as all revolutionists are. The end. Fourth International, Spring 1954, abridged. And this piece was labeled Trade Unionists and Revolutionists by James P. Cannon, originally written in 1953. Okay, so that is the end of Chapter 8. And it's the end of Part 2, I guess. I didn't even know we were in Part 2, but I guess we were in Part 2. The next part is Part 3, Angels, Devils, Political Folklore, and Historical Falsification. And the next chapter is titled Legends of the Fall. Thank you for listening.